is a 1985 Audi 5000, although actually it's quite a bit more than that. As you can tell, this doesn't look like a usual 1980s Audi. It's been modified by Treser, which was a 1980s Audi tuner that you've probably never heard of until now. But today, we're gonna learn all about it. Before I get started, big news, this Audi 5000 is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This is a very rare Treser Audi. Not many of these have survived, but this one has, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you've finished watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this Treser Audi 5000, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. So let's talk Audi 5000, although technically the correct name for this car is the Treser Super 5000. Treser was an Audi tuning company that was founded by Walter Treser, who is generally regarded as one of the originators of the idea of Audi Quattro. After he worked for Audi, he went off to start his own tuning company, and this vehicle is one of the results. So today I'm going to take you on a thorough tour of the Treser Super 5000 and show you some of its quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of this car with Treser. Treser. Who was he? What was he? And what is the deal with this car? So here's the basic story. Walter Treser, like I said, he worked at Audi, and he is considered one of the originators of the idea of the Quattro, the famous hatchback rally car in the 1980s, and of putting Quattro all-wheel drive on Audi vehicles and making it kind of their brand beginning in the 80s and basically ever since. Now, after that, Treser decided he wanted, I guess, more control of his own firm, and so he decided to start a tuning company that did some interesting things to Audis. And he had some very odd creations, including an Audi Quattro convertible. That's probably what he's best known, the Treser modified Audi Quattro Cabriolet. But there was more than just that. For instance, the Treser Hunter, which is this thing, like a lifted off-road sedan. It was an Audi 90, which was called the 4000 in the US at the time, but lifted up and off-roadified with a rear-mounted spare tire on a sedan. And it was very strange and crazy, but that's the kind of stuff he did. There was also this, the Treser Largo, which was sort of like an extended wheelbase, almost limo version of an Audi sedan. There were some really weird Treser creations, but Treser also did some more rational things, basically just modifying Audi, sort of like maybe AMG did back in that period as well. And one of his more prominent vehicles was a modified version of the Audi 5000. That would be this car. Now in Europe, that was called the Audi 100 or 200, depending on which specification you got, and Treser decided to just make it more. It had this wild-looking body kit, as you can see, very 80s, very like excessive and crazy, and different from Audi's conservative styling at the time, and it was tuned for way more power, around 250 horsepower, which was a serious number, especially back then. Now, that modified Audi 200 was called the Treser Super 200 because it was based on the Audi 200, and here in the States, something similar, this car is called the Treser Super 5000 because it is based on the Audi 5000. It was the same car, just named differently in the US. The only difference was the US version didn't get the power boost. Because of emissions regulations and other stuff, the US Treser Audis didn't have any extra power, they just had the body kit. So this car still has the same turbo 5-cylinder it had from the factory, about 140 horsepower, but it does have a rather insane body kit by Treser. And really, there were a lot of different components to this body kit. It totally transformed the looks of this vehicle. The standard Audi 5000, again, pretty conservative, relatively staid, but not the Treser version. And I'm going to show you everything. Let's start with the wheels. These were very distinctive Treser-looking wheels. All the Treser Audi models had some variation of this wheel design, and you can see it here, different from the Audi wheel, different from basically everything else, kind of interesting and unique, but it went well beyond that. There was also a front bumper, a more aggressive, more exciting looking front bumper that certainly transformed the look of this car from the front, again, compared to to a regular Audi 5000, and it got the same treatment in back. You had a more aggressive, sportier, but also very 80s looking rear bumper to help it stand out from other Audi models. And also around back, you had a spoiler, and not just a little one, but a large rear spoiler, went over the entire trunk lid and also like halfway down the rear side of the car. It was a very obvious and substantial modification, and there was still more. You had tinted taillights in the back when that wasn't really a thing, but this car had them to kind of match the gray paint and to give it a more aggressive, kind of special, interesting, sinister almost look, those tinted tails. You also had this little piece over the rear wheels that almost like covers up the top of the rear tire, which is kind of a throwback to some 70s cars. Cadillacs, Lincolns had this back then, and so does the Treser Audi to give it a more distinctive look. And then there was the badging. Now in front you still had the standard Audi badge, but below that on the Treser bumper you had a Treser badge to let you know even from the front that this wasn't your typical Audi. And it was the same deal in back. You can see it doesn't just say Audi, it says Treser Audi to let you know again that this was special and that this was different. Now as for the interior of this car, it wasn't quite as different as the outside, but it did have a few upgrades compared to standard Audi models. You had a different steering wheel. This isn't just the regular Audi wheel with just a Treser logo in the middle. Instead, it was completely changed out, I guess to give you a different feel while you were driving along, Treser. And also over on the passenger side of the dashboard, you have a little plaque here from Treser that was supposed to signify exactly who this vehicle was made for. It was supposed to be personalized so that you felt very appreciated by this rare Treser creation that was made just for you. But taken as a whole, I gotta say, this car looks pretty crazy. The interior is relatively the same as most other Audi models from this era, but on the outside you had this total transformation. I don't know that I'd be able to tell this was an Audi 5000. It just looks so different and so 80s and so weird. And what a time when there were all these body kits from all sorts of companies to try to modify cars in a very distinctive way. It certainly is an unusual look and kind of a cool one, and certainly kind of a weird one as well. This strange Treser Super 5000. But let's talk through the remaining quirks and features of this car beyond just all the Treser stuff. You'll find a lot of them on the inside. For one thing, the climate vents are arranged in a weird pattern. You have two vents to the left of the steering wheel between the driver and the door. Two. You have two more in the middle and then two more on the passenger side. 2, 2, 2, rather than your usual like 1, 3, 1. And it's kind of a weird thing. I guess Audi wanted to emphasize more of those outside vents to give people a chance to control their climate a little bit more than usual. And speaking of climate control in this car, the climate controls are also kind of strange. You have this big panel that says electronic climate control, making it very clear this car is proud of its electronic climate control. But the controls themselves are also kind of strange. You press these little colored buttons to change the temperature. Blue is for colder air, red is for warmer air, which doesn't seem very premium now, but at the time, I guess that's just how you did it. And you also had these controls for fan speed, low and then high, and automatic in the middle if you wanted to really use that electronic climate control system to its fullest extent. Now, it's worth pointing out why Audi was bragging so much about electronic climate control. I want to give a little bit of a history lesson about this car. The Audi 5000 in the mid-1980s was definitely a second-class citizen compared to Mercedes-Benz and BMW. These days, Mercedes, BMW, and Audi are all roughly on par because Audi has had some great success in the last 25, 30 years. But back in the 80s, Audi was more like Saab than Mercedes or BMW, and they just couldn't get footing compared to these massive rival German brands. But they were trying, and so they would advertise stuff like that electronic climate control to seem really cool and luxurious. Now, like I mentioned, this car was sold as the 100 or 200 in Europe, the 5000 here in North America, and in all those markets, it just wasn't quite the player that Mercedes or BMW was. But indeed, they were trying, and another good example of that is the sunroof, which has kind of an interesting way that it operates. First, you can open the sunroof just like normal. It's a panel instead of glass, but that was pretty common on all cars from this era, and it opens up just like a sunroof. But you will notice that in the sunshade, there's also a little flap. and you can open that too. If you press the sunroof button the other way, then the flap pops open, and that's when the sunroof is in its sort of venting position to get air into the interior. And the interesting part here is that you don't just push back the sunshade to get that vented air. Instead, this half sunshade flap opens up automatically in order to provide a little bit more air for the cabin. Kind of a strange setup. Also interesting in this car, in the center, you can see an infotainment screen. Although it's only about an inch by an inch, this little square in the center, it is certainly not a touchscreen, not full color, nothing like what we would know today. But if you tap this little switch at the bottom, it can go between various different information items, like showing your fuel range to empty, your average miles per hour, miles per gallon, your clock, of course. All of that stuff could be displayed in this little screen. Now, this is hardly an infotainment screen by modern standards, but you can see some of the beginnings in this little screen here. Automakers were getting the idea, what if we put screens in the center? And this was sort of one of those rudimentary early examples of that. And next up, we move on to the back seat of the Audi 5000, or rather the Treser Super 5000. The back seat is actually pretty roomy, although that's not a big surprise. The 5000 was intended to be a competitor to like the Mercedes E-Class or the BMW 5 Series of its day, so it was that size, sort of mid-size, almost verging on large, and as a result, it has decent legroom back here. You can sit back here and feel pretty comfortable in the back of your Super 5000. And there are some other items back here that increase your comfort. You have rear climate vents, which is actually pretty cool to see, not especially common in the mid-1980s. You also have a rear seat cigarette lighter, which was very common in the mid-1980s, especially on European cars. German cars, a lot of Germans smoked in that era, so they had to put cigarette lighters everywhere, and that meant you also got ashtrays built into your rear doors. Driver and passenger doors both had ashtrays because that was a really emphasized point in German cars back then. One other cool item of this car, if you fold down the center armrest, you can see there's like a bag here. This is a ski sack. The theory of this was you could stick your skis in the trunk and then have them sort of push through the trunk and into the cabin, but if they were dirty and filled with snow and other debris, you didn't want them to get everywhere, so there's a sack that keeps all that stuff in it and it doesn't get in your interior. This would save you from having to mount roof racks or ski racks in your car or deal with mounting the skis on those racks. You just stick them in your trunk and then through your ski sack, and that's how you could transport skis. This was a big deal on a car that was pushing all-wheel drive as a major benefit. And next up, we move on to the other opening areas of this car, the trunk and of course the hood and the engine bay. The trunk is nothing really special. You just pop it open and there's a trunk. It looks fairly standard, doesn't have any quirks or features, although it is reasonably large size, which is nice to see. As for the engine, of course, that's up front, and like I said, turbo 5-cylinder. Audi was famous for their turbo 5-cylinders in the 80s and early 90s, and this car has one, although it only made about 140 horsepower. Not really an enormous amount of performance for this car, especially considering the cool, sporty body kit. Now, like I said, European versions of these Treser Super Audis had way more power, but it wouldn't really pass American regulations and emissions. You would have had to do all sorts of compliance stuff, so they just threw on the body kit, and that was all they did to the Treser Audis of the day. Also interesting about this particular Treser Super 5000, it was sold new here in Southern California, and it's been here ever since. And you can see this massive stack of paperwork of service receipts and repair records from shops here in Southern California going back to when it was new in the 80s. This is exceptionally uncommon. Audis were very unpopular in the 1980s. There was this whole scandal, unintended acceleration, which should be the topic of a whole other video. But anyway, not many people were buying Audis back then. BMW and Mercedes were doing better, but European luxury cars in general just weren't as popular as they are now. And it was hard to find Audis back then, especially ones with expensive aftermarket body kits. But this car had it, and it was sold new here in California, and it's been here ever since, which is pretty crazy. All right, driving the Treser Super 5000, which from a driving perspective is pretty much just an Audi 5000. Now, I will say that the owner of this car, the seller on Cars and Bids, told me that there was some talk that there was some extra power put in when these cars came to North America, but both he and I agree you don't really feel it when you're driving the car around. It feels quicker than you'd expect for 140 horsepower actually, but it doesn't feel dramatically quick. Now, interestingly, I have an Audi from this era. I have a 1994 Audi RS2, which is actually 9 years after this car, but still old Audis, not too many of those around. And I have to say, the difference between these two cars is night and day. The RS2 is definitely more of like a high-strung, high-performance, like sporty car, and it's really a special, you know, fun, thrilling driving experience. This car is definitely more in the vein of, you know, it was a bigger sedan, and it was a front-wheel drive based car, like all Audis are now, or most Audis are now, frankly. And, you know, it was fine. I mean, it does what it's supposed to do, and it drives, and it steers, but it's not like a true, serious performance car. This was never intended to be that. It was more of a, you know, luxury passenger driving car than a fun, fast, thrilling, get in the car and go kind of vehicle. And the Treser upgrades, even if they did add some extra power, it didn't really provide much of that. And it certainly gave the car a distinctive look, and a special one, and kind of a weird one, frankly. And it was maybe made it more unusual and interesting visually. But this car still, it drives, I don't want to say it's slow, but it does sort of have kind of a slow feel to the driving experience. The steering is relatively slow. Obviously the acceleration isn't much. And just generally, it's sort of a slower car. It's just a luxury sedan, basically. It was not intended to be like a true performance car. Really, the crazy thing about this car is that Treser connection, the old school body kit. It's neat, and it's exciting, and it's kind of weird, and it's kind of cool and interesting. But I wouldn't say that this car is like absolutely thrilling other than that. Now, there are a lot of special cars in the world where that's the case, that they had, you know, some visual or stylistic appeal that made them special, or some rarity factor that made them special. They didn't drive incredibly amazingly, and that's sort of the truth of this car too. I will say it does feel solid. It's interesting. I've driven Mercedes models from this era and BMW models from this era, and this car feels more Mercedes than BMW. It has a surprisingly solid feel to it on the road. Like I said, slow steering but heavy steering, and a generally solid interior. Not many creaks or rattles, and it feels like it's kind of well built and solid when you're just cruising around. I'm sort of surprised by that. I've never really driven an 80s Audi before, and so this car is kind of impressive in the sense that it does have sort of some of that German solidity that, yeah, I wasn't really sure that Audis had back then. Overall, though, I gotta say, you know, this car is interesting, it's fun, it's quirky. Obviously, you would be the star of a Radwood event in this car. Any 80s, 90s car gathering, this thing would be a hit, but it's not some crazy performance car. It's not especially thrilling or exciting. It's just interesting and weird for people who like interesting and weird. And this one is certainly an obscure vehicle that is interesting to check out. And so that's the Audi 5000 Treser, also known as the Treser Super 5000. It's weird, it's quirky, it's not especially fast, and it's very 1980s. And I'll probably never find another Treser Audi ever again, but you can find this one on Cars and Biz. And now it's time to give this interesting sedan a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 44 out of 100, which places the Treser Super 5000 here against some rivals, although truthfully there's nothing else I've reviewed quite like this car. The E32 BMW 750iL is more impressive in terms of performance and power, and the LS400 is more reliable and practical, but this Audi just looks so 1980s and cool. Its styling certainly beats out anything else like it. It's an old Audi, so it probably won't be reliable, and it's certainly not fast, but it is cool, and you'll turn every head at an 80s car gathering.